So, hello to all participants and guests on behalf of IIM Ahmedabad and the Ashank Desai Center for Leadership and Organizational Development. I welcome you all to this research series webinar. We have with us here Mr. Ashank Desai, the founder, ex-chairman of MASTEC, and also one of the thought leaders behind the Ashank Desai Center of Leadership and Organizational Development, or ADCLOD as some of us refer to it. Thank you, sir, for joining us today. Very
Thank
happy
you.
to have you here. It is also my pleasure to welcome and introduce Dr. Mary Uhl-Bien, our esteemed speaker tonight. Dr. Uhl-Bien is a globally acclaimed expert in leadership and organizational behavior. Her research on complexity leadership has been helpful for researchers and practitioners, especially those of us who work in the field of adaptive leadership. In addition to this, she's also well renowned for her research on relational leadership, followership, and leader member exchange behavior. We are delighted to have this opportunity, Dr. Uhl-Bien, to learn from your deep research work and gain valuable insights into how to foster adaptability in organizations. Thank you so much for joining us today. Interestingly, Dr. Uhl-Bien's work has been extrapolated from science and has been connected with organizational dynamics in interesting ways, as we shall witness today. Dr. Uhl-Bien's list of accomplishments and accolades is very long, and we may not be able to list all of them here. However, I would like to share some of her achievements with us today. Dr. Uhl-Bien is currently the BNSF Railway Endowed Professor of Leadership in the Neely School of Business at Texas Christian University. In addition to her PhD from the University of Cincinnati, Carl H. Lindes College of Business, she was also awarded an honorary doctorate from Copenhagen Business School in 2023. In the same year, she has been awarded an Eminent Leadership Scholar Award at the Academy of Management, which is the highest academic honor bestowed upon a scholar. Dr. Uhl-Bien is listed in Stanford's top 2% of scientists in the world. Her papers and articles have won numerous awards, including 2 LQ Decennial Awards, an LQ Best Paper Award, and the Walker Prize for Best Paper in Advancing HR. She's a highly sought after speaker, giving keynotes and invited talks around the world, as well as serving as a regular commentator on the CNBC Squawk Box. We at the ADCLOD Center have been fortunate to interact with her over the past few days. We have been especially moved by her warmth and her grace. We are sure you will enjoy interacting with her as much as we have enjoyed being with her at IIM Ahmedabad. The structure of today's talk is going to be as such. Dr. Uhl-Bien will present her work for about 40-45 minutes. Please feel free to ask your questions and share your views through the chat box. Towards the end, we will devote about 10 to 15 minutes to address a select set of questions. Thanks once again to our participants and our guests for your interest and your presence. Over to you, Dr. Uhl-Bien. Please.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you for the nice introduction. It's been great working with all of you as well. I do give this talk around the world, but I have not given it to or in India. So this is a new one for me. This is kind of fun. I always have a warm place in my heart for India and my Indian colleagues. From the time I started working in the university, it seems I've always had colleagues from India in the department. We have a great time. My husband's name is Roger, but I call him Raj. And at one point they said, is he Indian? His name is Raj. So it feels great to be here with all of you. I look forward to the interaction. I know we're not going to have a whole lot of time for Q&A, but I appreciate the opportunity and I'm really interested to see how this lands in India. All right, so I'm going to share with you a body of work we've been doing. I started this work in 2001, and the reason I started it is because I was a young scholar and I was starting out my profession in leader-member exchange theory. I was asked to do some consulting for an organization, and I was asked to teach executive education. And when I started doing that, I realized that the work that I was doing didn't have application to practice. It was simply saying a manager should develop a good relationship with their employees, with the subordinates. And when I started consulting to Jim Smith at State Farm Insurance, He did that for about a month, and then he said, "That's really not my job." And I said, "Oh, okay. So what is your job?" So I was supposed to be consulting for him, but I think he really taught me. I learned most of my leadership from the work that I've done with my practice partners. I felt like I was a schizophrenic because on the one hand, I would be doing research, and on the other hand, I would be doing practice, and these two things didn't link up. So I started searching for something that would work for us. And in 2001, Jerry Hunt introduced me to Russ Marion, who was doing complexity work. And Russ sent me his book. We wrote the first paper together. We were shocked when it won the Best Paper Award. People said, "This really has some promise. We think that this is what leadership needs. Keep doing it." And so we did. And little did we know in 2001, we could see complexity coming, but we had no idea it would come to the extent that it did in 2020 with the COVID and the global pandemic, which is absolutely an example of complexity. So what I want to share with you today is a couple of things. Our goals for the discussion are for you to understand very simply what complexity is and why it's happening, and then most importantly, what it means for how we need to lead differently. I think most people understand that leadership is very different today from what it used to be. And then the second part of it is once we have that understanding of the basic model, I want to help you understand what we call the adaptive process. The adaptive process is the core dynamic in this model. It comes from living systems. It comes from science, physical and biological sciences, and it helps us to understand how systems adapt to be able to survive. So I call the core dynamic the adaptive process, and adaptive space is the way that we enable the adaptive process. So we'll run through that and talk about how to use that to ideate and scale adaptive change into a system. And just so you know, a system is fractal. So a system can be a person, it can be a group, an organization, a society. So the same process occurs across different scale. And that's the exciting thing. If you understand the basic process, then you understand how you can apply it across any kind of situation that involves a living system. All right, so what is complexity? The simplest way to describe it is rich interconnectivity. And when I talk about this, it's very easy for people to understand interconnectivity. We are in an interconnected world. Everybody knows that now. Of course, COVID showed that a virus that started off from, the story goes, a person that ate an infected pangolin in China ended up changing profoundly everything around the world. So our world is interconnected by the fact that here I am sitting in my home in Texas talking to all of you in India. The key to the complexity is this word rich. So what does rich mean when we combine it with interconnectivity? And that's really the dynamism of the model. Rich means that when things interact together, they can create sparks of emergence events that science calls a phase transition. So complexity is really defined by phase transitions, a phase transition to a different state. And the key thing to understand here is that complexity doesn't mean complicated. When we first started this work, a lot of people thought that complexity was complicated, and those were the same thing. They're not the same thing. And here's an example that Paul Cillier, one of the early pioneers in complexity work and applying it beyond physical and biological sciences, taught me, and I've used it ever since because it seems to work very well. Jumbo jets are complicated, but mayonnaise is complex. And here's the reason. If you have a jumbo jet and you attach parts to it, those parts don't change the other parts. So when you attach rubber or steel or glass, none of those things will change, and you can actually decompose it back. So you could take it apart and still have the original pieces when you're done. In mayonnaise, it's only a few ingredients, but when you mix them together, they generate a phase transition to a different state. So magically, through this interactive dynamic, they transform each other. And once you have mayonnaise, you can't go back to the original ingredients. So this is really a way to think about complexity. It's these rich interactions that when they bump up against each other and they mix together or they interact, they generate a phase transition to a different state. And in that new state, there's no going back. Once you're in it, you are in a new state. Interestingly, during COVID, this was very, very clearly demonstrated when we called it the new normal. the term new normal had to come up because people kept waiting. Well, we're going to go back. Let's wait till we go back. And the key is there is no going back. I remember I was working with my students who were seniors in college. It was their senior year in fall of 2020. And I could see the first 4 or 5 weeks of the semester, I could see they were just waiting. They were sitting there waiting. And I finally said to them, what's going on here? What are you guys doing? They said, well, we're waiting for it to go back. I said, it's never going back. This is it. This is your senior year. You're not going to be back in person in the way you were. You're not going to have the senior year that you thought you were going to have. So what you have to do is mindset shift. You only get one. This is your one time. You will be a senior in college. You're going to have to make the best of it and figure out how to adjust to this new situation. So that's really the mindset and the idea of complexity, is that there is not going back. You have to adjust to the new normal. I like this picture that showed COVID during the pandemic, because I always think about emergence and complexity as dots and lines. I think of it as a flowing dot. And actually, if you were to type this into the internet, you would see that it's a moving dot. And that's exactly how I think about complexity, this dynamism and movement and fluidity of the interactions that are occurring. And so this first chart shows how it originated in China, and then it started to spread, and then quickly it spread all around the world, and then continued more spread. This is really what emergence is. Emergence is this idea of things that are interacting and spreading and amplifying and creating change in a system. So again, that's going to help us, because if we think about these dots, when I think about complexity, I think about dots and lines. When this is the big change, then, if we're thinking about leadership, if we apply all of this to leadership, is that traditional models of leadership are top down, and the focus is on hierarchy and control. But complexity models view leadership as a collaborative process. This is really the shift in thinking, and this is why the relational work was so key once I got into complexity. Traditional leadership theory thinks about individuals. It comes from psychology. It's usually people's heads, so the cognitive process in our head, or it's individual differences. It might be some socio-emotional issues or some relational issues, relationship issues that come up. But what complexity really brought to us was a change and a shift to thinking about leadership as a process. It's not just an interaction or an individual, it's a process. It's a social phenomenon when people come together and start interacting. And the key to complexity is it's a collaborative process. So this really links to the work that was done in the 2000s to start distributing leadership. When they started thinking about leadership as not just lying in an individual, but being distributed. That was the key to the relational work. I worked a lot with Sonia Ospina. She and I were developing the relational leadership theory. And I said to her, she didn't like it. She was a sociologist. And I said, you need a term for what you're doing. She hated that. But finally, I said to her, well, call it collective leadership, that leadership is a collective. And I think that when we talk in complexity, it's a form of collective leadership, but a particular form that's a collaboration. So to me, collaboration or collaborative is the best way to describe what's happening in this type of leadership. It's one form of leadership. It doesn't mean it's all leadership. It occurs in the situation of complexity when you need it. But this is the particular angle or lens that we're bringing to the work. The focus then in complexity is on enabling adaptability. So the key thing here, again, is this work comes from physical and biological systems on living systems that operate in environments that shift or change. And when they shift or change, you need to be able to adapt. So I wrote a piece in 2018 where I reviewed research on adaptability. And surprisingly, there's not a big field of adaptability. We have leadership, we have all of these other phenomena, we have trust research, we have communication, but we don't have a study of adaptability. It's spread across a lot of different theories. So that 2018 piece was really trying to say, okay, what do we know about it, and how does it link to this work? This is a chart that Max Boisseau and Bill McKelvey worked on. It was published in 2010. It was early in the work, and Bill McKelvey and I had published a paper together in 2007. I was sitting in Academy of Management, and I was telling him the kinds of things I was dealing with, and he drew this picture on a napkin. And I said, oh my gosh, this is exactly what I need and exactly what we're talking about in terms of understanding complexity. So in complexity, they talk about different zones. Max and Bill called it regimes. There's an order zone or an order regime, an adaptive regime, and chaos. Chaos looks like this situation of things that are happening and there's no connection between them. So people who are experiencing chaos experience it as no ability to make sense of what's happening, no pattern, no connection that's visible. That's a rare kind of state. But if you think about complexity, a lot of people, when they experienced COVID the first time, experienced it more as chaos. If you're prepared for it, I was prepared for it because I have a doctoral student in China, and he was telling me about 2 months before it happened here in the US, Mary, go buy masks. He lives in Alabama. He said, all the masks are sold out. The Chinese have all bought them all around the state. And I said, what are you talking about? Masks? And so he really informed me of what was coming. And by the time it hit, my husband and I were completely prepared. We had everything we needed. We were ready for lockdown. And other people were saying, what is this? They thought that things were going to continue. So that, I think those people experienced it more as chaos. Whereas if you have a brain trained toward complexity, you don't go into chaos as much. You can start to see some patterns. They look more like this middle picture of a fluid dynamic network versus the bottom, which is the way we traditionally think about order and things being ordered. So in organizations, we impose order by creating hierarchy and trying to use discipline, traditional hierarchical control. And that does work in organizations when we have to have it. So we have both the old and the new. We must have the hierarchy. But if we try to respond to complexity with that hierarchy, we're not going to be successful. And I think everybody pretty much knows that now. All right, so what an adaptive response does is in complexity, there are two types of responses, an adaptive response or an order response. Some people want to or wanted to respond to complexity with order. Their natural reaction is to go to order. We don't like this, take it back to what it was before, make us feel better, and they pressure leaders. So it's not just leaders doing this. It's actually often the followers or the employees who want this. They want to be taken back to a safe state, a safe place, a place that they know. This was my students sitting in the classroom their senior year saying, I want it to go back. Please just tell me it's going to go back and things are going to return to what I understand and what I know. And again, this is why we had to coin the term the new normal. So an adaptive response instead focuses on enabling adaptability. And remember again, the fractal. So this can be a person or an organization. I work doing a lot of executive development now, executive ed. I have partners in healthcare. So if anybody on this call is familiar with or associated with healthcare, you understand that healthcare is in complexity. In the US, it's been in complexity for a long time. I'm pretty much a healthcare person now. I didn't intend to be, but I ended up there because there's so much in complexity that I get contacted by them. So I do work with healthcare, and working with Cook Children's and Texas Health Resources here in town, I've been able to drive major organizational transformation using leadership development. And now in the program that we've been doing a lot of organizational transformation, I'm really excited because next week, the adaptive challenge we have is, okay, how do we now get the new medical directors, the division chiefs that we've just created, that title or position, how do we get them individually developing? So I'm going to show them a slide deck. They've seen this. They understand that their organization operates this way, but I'm going to tell them how it works in their heads. So this same dynamic of it's chaos in my head, or I want to go to order in my head. I want to stay stable. I don't want to think about these things. It's too stressful. You have to engage this process in your head as well. So there's an individual level of this. And then, of course, like I said, the group, but in the organizational level. Leading in complexity then looks like this. It's both. And this was really added in my work with Texas Health, because as I was talking about this, they kept hearing me say, we need to go to the left side of this picture, the emergence and the adaptive space. And they weren't comfortable because they kept saying, well, we have to do the other stuff. So I drew this picture for them to say, yes, we still do need to have the hierarchy. We still do need technical hierarchical responses. And those are appropriate to certain kinds of challenges that you face. But a lot of the challenges you face in healthcare, Texas Health and Cook Children's, are really more about complexity. And so you can't respond using what you know. You have to engage this emergence and adaptive space. And they are understanding that and beginning to do that now. It is not their norm. Cook Children's, it's their norm. This is how they operate. We've been working with them for 10 years. I think they already were probably doing this to some extent even before we started the work. But that's absolutely how they respond to complexity. other organizations we're dealing with are just starting to learn this process, or they do it, but they don't know what they're doing. All right, so the problem of the order response is that it focuses on stability and old order. It pulls back to equilibrium and it leads to stagnation and death. So again, we saw this happen during COVID. People who didn't respond appropriately or who tried to still do the same thing. This was the first time people in my profession, at least, started to understand. Everybody always said, well, leadership doesn't really matter. It's not like we're saving lives here. If we were saving lives, it would be different. And during COVID, leadership really was about whether we were saving lives or not, literally. So the way that we led truly led to life or death for people, the decisions that we made. So I hope that people understand how critically important this is, that we don't underestimate the importance, the influence, and the power of leadership and followership and the way that they impact things that happen to us. All right, so this is now the piece. That's the background on complexity. I'm hoping that you understand it. Most of us engage with it now. Before COVID, people weren't really getting it. I have a colleague here, Michael Sheridan. He and I talked about this for quite a long time. And Kayla McKittrick was working in our exec center. And after COVID happened, she told me about 3 months later, she said, I hope it's okay for me to quote her. This is a quote. She said, I said, holy shit, this is what Mary and Michael have been talking about. And the fact that she said that, it's demonstrated the emotion and the passion that she had around it. She'd been listening to us talk about complexity. She'd been selling our programs. She was our marketing and business development person, but she really didn't fully get it. And then in COVID, she said, a light bulb went off. And all of a sudden, I realized this is what you all had been talking about. So that's the complexity piece. In it, we need to do an adaptive response. I'm going to show you now the core dynamic that's involved. The first thing that happens is we have what I call complexity pressures. We're all familiar with this. These are pressures that come in and it's experienced as a pressure. You can call it stress. It's stress on a system and it's pressuring it to change. So complexity has happened. An emergence event has occurred. It has changed something around us, and that's pushing on us to cause us to have to change. In our earliest work in 2007, when we were looking at this, I was partnering with a person who worked in banking, and he was the chief innovation officer. He was in charge of talent and innovation. And he sponsored our research study. When we looked at the data, he said, oh gosh, it's very clear to me, this part of the model isn't the problem. The push for change is not the problem. People understand that. We naturally respond to it and we naturally ideate. So ideation happens. Just think about yourself. Something happens, it's changing automatically in many ways because we have to do this. Our brains start thinking, oh, I need to do this, I need to do that. This is different. So this push for change starts activating, if you can think of it that way, it energizes. But the challenge of it is because of the way our systems are, our brains are, the way we are, our organizations for sure, this push for change is also met with a push for stability. So this is the desire to stay stable, and this can manifest in different ways. I would encourage each of you to think about how that manifests for you or for your organization. In some cases, it might be what I said earlier. We don't like this, we want to go back. In other cases, it might be people saying, but wait a minute, we can't do that because of this. When I started the complexity work early on, Russ and I knew this had a lot of potential. And I knew that this is where I wanted to go in my career. But I couldn't. So I'm saying, oh, yes, I need to leave the leader member exchange and I need to go start doing complexity leadership. But there was another voice saying, hey, the world doesn't get it. I need to get publications. I'm never going to get publications. I have a family I have to feed. How am I going to feed my family if I can't by running to this whole new thing? So what I did is I continued some of the LMX work, but then I morphed it into something that served as a bridge. That only can occur because I engaged those two things together. So again, I know that you do this. I know you have experienced this. This is the core dynamic. So think about that. Now, pressures can also come in on the other side. I don't have the picture here. I do that many times. Pressures can also come in for push for stability. So these pressures and tensions are happening all over. What that does is it puts these two things into tension. And that's dissonance, or it's stress, or it's this conversation that's happening. If it's between people, it looks like conflict. And that tension can be uncomfortable. The person who I think has done the best work on this, the earliest work, and was really prescient in seeing this change coming was Ron Heifetz at Harvard, who in the early 90s wrote about the work of leadership in his adaptive leadership model. I believe he understood this from psychodynamics and other areas that he pulled this in on. But essentially, he said, people want leaders to make them feel comfortable, but they shouldn't. We need to engage the discomfort. We need to engage the tension. So we always talked about this as tension. In the model, I call it the tension dynamic. It's a core dynamic. And I like to think of this as making the tension adaptive. So adaptive tension. In creativity, they refer to this as creative abrasion. There are lots of terms for it, but basically it's the idea that you have to engage the tension rather than make it go away. People weren't understanding the word tension, so we were playing around with this, and my practice partners were really helping at this stage to figure out how to present this because it was very academic. And so we changed the word, and we called it conflicting. So we're going to get to conflicting, but I forgot I had this order response back in here. So let me talk about the order response. What happens in the order response is that people don't like the tension and they wipe it out. Now, this can be the individual, so I don't like it. Somebody's telling me I have to change. I don't like it. I'm just going to ignore it. I'm going back to my old state. That's the individual response. Or in the organization, a leader's trying to drive change or a follower is trying to drive change, and people don't like that. So they start wiping it out. They push against it. We just went through a major change in our college. We did a curriculum change. Our curriculum had never changed here. It was the same curriculum when I was an undergraduate. Now, that's a long time ago. So this really was indicating, are we seriously doing what we should be doing here? When I came in as department chair over a year ago, we decided to start driving the core change. The people who were leading this took it to committee. So they take it to our undergraduate committee. And then the committee members take it out. Okay, we have this proposal on the table. It comes out in the form of a piece of paper. And immediately, what happens is faculty start saying no. So our faculty start saying no. And I hear in our hallways, they came after us 7 years ago. They're coming after us again. So I said, stop. Nobody's coming after you. If it's anything, it's me, because we need this change to happen. So they wouldn't listen to that. I had to go to the people who were leading this and say, pull it out of committee, stop, this is not the way to do it. We had to then go out to the individuals, and we did it in each department. Each department chair started working, and I used data. I showed my faculty data, and I found out what is it that's going on here. So the point of that is the natural response, the automatic response, the visceral response is to wipe out that tension and stay in the old order. And what leaders need to do is not let that happen, because when that happens, the push for change goes away. And now you're in a stability, but it's an old order. It's outdated. It's no longer relevant. What the adaptive response does then is it engages that tension. And as I said earlier, we're going to change this word because my practice colleagues were saying people don't like tension. So we started calling it conflicting, not conflict, conflicting. This is very similar to conflict. So we know it, we understand it as conflict. But the word conflicting is basically getting at the idea that things are conflicting. They're coming together, they're pushing up against each other, and they are conflicting with one another. The definitional way of thinking about complexity is heterogeneous views. You can't do it through homogeneity. You need to bring in all these different worldviews and perspectives, and you need to engage them in an ideation process. So that's conflicting. I spent a lot of time working with people on this. It was really funny when we were working with Cook Children's, and Matt Zurich came in as the president of the Physician Network, and he started picking up on this word. The chief financial officer came in to do a presentation and used the word conflict, and the whole room says, no, conflicting. We need conflicting. So they model it there. What Matt will do is he will get with Nancy Cycle, who is the second to the CEO on the administrative, the hospital side, and they just start going at it. They sit in the room and you can see them, and the physicians will sit there and look at them like, what are you doing? And they said, we're conflicting. And they said, we do this all day long. So it's really critically important that people understand this notion or concept of conflicting. If I put it in a historical perspective, when I first started doing research and doing work in this profession, we didn't have enough conflicting. We had hierarchical models that suppressed voice. If you look at organizational behavior work, voice and silence are a key concept that have emerged since the 90s, the 1990s, and really taken off now. A huge body of work on this, on voice. And essentially that's because they're trying to talk about how do we do conflicting. So that's the same basic idea. Now, today I would say we do too much conflicting. If you look at what social media has done, everybody in the world now has a voice. Everybody's now an expert. Everybody wants to say what they have to say, and they're not willing to listen to the other. That, in my mind, isn't conflicting, because if you have too much of that disagreement without connecting, you're not going to get anywhere. So the only way that conflicting really works is if you combine it with connecting. And connecting, in my opinion, is the #1 leadership challenge in the world today. It's the biggest challenge we have. It's a very unique skill. It's one that I would like, in spending the next 5 years or so, I really want to help people understand what this skill is and how to do it. There are techniques around it. So you need to have connecting in combination with conflicting. When you have those two things, that's what generates an adaptive solution. So you bring the group together. When I present this at Texas Health, with a group that's naive to this, they have no clue what's going on. All I do is put up a picture of this and they say, oh yeah, we did that all during COVID. They all did it during COVID. They'll tell me story after story of how this process occurred. And this conflicting, connecting process is adaptive space. What's happening now is, because COVID and the pressures are gone, is the system is going back to equilibrium, and hierarchy, control, bureaucracy are creeping back in. Complexity naturally opens up adaptive space. It's always going to happen. You have complexity pressures coming in because it activates that push for change. So adaptive space is opened. What you have to do is make sure that you keep it open and don't close it. All right, so lots of things that can be discussed there. With that core dynamic, then, what I want to do is quickly run you through and show you what this looks like on the organizational level. So I've discussed a bit the individual level and what happens in our head. Let's look at the organizational level. It starts on the left-hand side, and this is what we call, in this model, I call it exploration and operations. That was more comfortable for Texas Health. In the academic work, we call it entrepreneurial and operational. So there's an entrepreneurial system or area or activity that occurs in the organization, and then there are the operational components. And those are the things that usually engage in the conflicting. So those are the two sides of the circle. As we're trying to ideate and scale change, we get an idea that starts emerging in the entrepreneurial space. So people start ideating on a local level. That doesn't mean geographically local, it means who they're engaging with. And they'll do it around an adaptive challenge. And they'll use the pressures and the tension of the adaptive challenge to ideate. And then they'll do this process, they'll socialize and iterate until they think they have something that's working. If you know design thinking, they'll do experimentation and piloting, and they'll, on a small scale, start proving that their adaptive solution, developing the adaptive solution and providing some data or proof, evidence that that works. The challenge then is they've got to scale it into the system. And once you start scaling it more broadly, now you get the dynamic happening all over again. So what we tell people is, yes, you need the entrepreneurial, you need to protect the people in your organization who can do this and support them. As it flows across, this is where really we get into very different kinds of dynamics, because people who champion and work it across the system are going to be different kinds of people from the ones who are ideating. And then the people who are able to pull it into the operational system are also different. So you see that collaborative process I was talking about. I spent a lot of time with my students, their leadership students. The #1 thing I have to teach them is how to do followership. They all want to be leaders, and they struggle with followership. I have people who are elected into the cabinet positions, incredible individual leaders, and I work with them deeply on how do you follow? How do you partner with people in leadership positions? How do you engage that collaborative process? That is the core to it. So you need to be able to engage that appropriately. And then what we do is we talk about collectively, how does that flow across? So when you're in this process, you have to understand that you're going to have an idea, but it's going to morph and change as it goes across the system. And once it gets implemented, it can look very different. So that's to be expected. This is what we call emergence. This is where you have to recognize that you're in emergence and engage with emergence. So I'm nearing the concluding part of this, and now I want to get very practical. And again, you see, I can give you a highlight of this, but there's a lot of conversation that comes into the specifics of how do we actually do it. But if I were to lay out to you, you say, well, I want to do this in my organization. How do I do it? First is to adopt the complexity mindset and understand and recognize when you're in complexity. When you're in complexity, you need to enable an adaptive response. Then you try to use the adaptive space. You try to create and enable and support and protect the adaptive space that's naturally there. We wipe it out. So try to use the natural adaptive space. And doing that, number one is convening. How do you bring people together? Who are the key players? So if you think about that entrepreneurial process that I talked about, there are key players that need to come together. They're usually from very different areas, and they will engage the conflicting that you need. So who has access to information, knowledge, or perspectives that would help this process? And then who do we need to link up across the organization? So one of the things that happens when I was working with one organization with Texas Health, we got inside the organization. So we were in the local system here, but this is different from Cook, which has one organization. They have lots of companies, but basically it's one structure. In Texas Health, they have 30,000 people that they've brought together from all different kinds of areas because they continue to consolidate and acquire. And they have a very high level, upper level administration. We weren't there. We weren't at the upper level. And I kept saying, we need to get to the upper level. I had the president of the local hospital, but we didn't have the sponsor at the upper level. So that's been a challenge for us. And we did hit obstacles because of it. And I told them this is what was going to happen. So now I'm working with them. They say they want to continue. I say, I will not continue until we have the key players that we need at the top, because the only way we're going to drive this change is if we get the right kind of support at that level that understands this. So you need to think about who you link up. They were thinking locally in their hospital. I said, who do you want from what they call the tower or from corporate to come in and help with this? All right, so step 2 is then the ideation process. You create the conditions for the ideation or the adaptive process to occur. I set that up earlier to tell you that that's what that dynamic is called. So now you need to create the conditions for conflicting and connecting. This is the primary leadership development work we do. We create the adaptive space for people to come together, and then we facilitate and enable the conflicting and connecting process and show them what it is and how it works. You have to have psychological safety. This is where people need to feel comfortable that they can speak up, they're not going to get punished. And this became a challenge for us with some of the organizations we work with. So this is, again, why I need good sponsors, because they really need to help provide that psychological safety. And then managing the tension. One of the key things that I do is, as I'm enabling this adaptive space and facilitating, tension will go really high. So I have to figure out how to manage the tension. I naturally do this because I've been doing this work for a long time. People who are good at this will naturally do it. You don't necessarily understand or see what they're doing, but it looks like this. So if we go back to the chart, when complexity happens, people often experience it as chaos. Think about COVID, chaos. Originally in the work, I said, oh, we don't like order. We don't want to go to order. We want to go to complexity. But what I have learned, and COVID taught me, is people can't function if they're in chaos. So you can bring them down to order. You should bring them down to order. Make them feel better. The challenge is you can't keep them there. That's where they want to stay. If you're driving an adaptive response, you have to bring them back up. So you have to bring them back up into complexity, into that adaptive response zone. Make them a little bit uncomfortable, do the conflicting, increase the tension. This again is Ron Heifetz's Cook the Conflict. He's brilliant in the work that he's done on that. As you do that and you bring them back up, what naturally is going to happen is they're going to tip into chaos again. So they're going to go too high. And the thing is, some people will tip into chaos, some will not. So there are individual differences around this. So I had this happen with a group I was working with last year. They went into chaos. Even the people who were my sponsors went into chaos. So I had to go around the room and I did a quick just intervention. I made it up on the spot. I'd never done it before. And I found some people who weren't in chaos. And I said, why are you not in chaos? They said, or why are you not too stressed? They said, I'm excited about this. So I use that to pull it back down. So you pull it back down again and get them operating, and then you continue this process. So this is really the idea of adaptive tension, keeping the tension adaptive, and managing the tension dynamic. And then step 3 is this process here, sorry. So it's this process of enabling the flow across the organization, helping champion the change into the system. Lots of stories I could tell here. I won't do it because I don't have time. So let's show an animation of this. You have an agent. This can be a person. So in this case, it is a person, but remember that agents aren't just human. They're ideas or technology. Right now we have an agent, which is AI. Who knows what's going to happen with AI, but that agent is starting to activate in our world, and it's going to start connecting and linking up with things that are going to create a flow. So it's not just human, but we have a person here in an organization who's activating, they're pulsing, they're feeling that pressure, and they're ideating. And they start that local process that I told you about. So they start the entrepreneurial process at the local level, and they start spreading. They go through the conflicting and connecting, they make the adaptations, and they start to build a movement. And in this local area, they come up with an adaptive solution that's working. So now they want to scale it. Now, this is where I think this model is really important. I told you I think of it as dots and lines. You have to shift your thinking away from org chart and from divisions and hierarchy to thinking of systems as networks, thinking of organizations as networks. You're connecting across networks. So in this case, you're trying to go out, you try to do some connecting. So we're flipping it. We started with conflicting before. Here we're trying to connect as we go out. Same dynamic, but it's connecting and conflicting. You connect, you make some connections, but you're always going to hit conflicting. This is the critical thing for people to understand is conflicting is always going to happen when you go out. So you have to expect it. You have to engage with it. And the best way to deal with that is then take the conflicting as information. Don't take it as a no. Don't take it as I'm being stopped. Take it and in fact, approach it from a questioning or inquiry perspective, because if you're asking for a yes or no and you get a no, you are stopped, but you're doing that to yourself. So get information and think about how you can continue the conflicting or the connecting process. How can you get to connecting? So as you're doing this, what is happening is, and why this is hard is now you see the yellow is going out. The change that's happening is in these other areas. So the iteration, once you start the connecting process, is these things are starting to tip over and change. And if you want to imagine it, they would turn yellow. So now we've got yellow spreading. That's why this is hard. You're asking other areas to change. And in fact, I would say it's not even yellow. It might be a green or a purple because they're changing. They might not look exactly the same as the others. And that's the other thing too. It's not a one size fits all. Adaptation can morph and look very different. So if you think about COVID, the things that happened were different everywhere. There were some patterns to it, but it wasn't exactly the same. And that's the same in organizations. That's the problem with benchmarking. We think there's one solution, we go out and find it and implement it everywhere. It just doesn't work like that. All right, so now you're continuing this process. You do the conflicting and connecting. Remember, again, you are always going to hit conflicting. You need people who can understand how to do that. In the original model, I had what was called the gray dot over here. And this is still important. This is what we discovered in the early work when we looked at the innovation process. This gray dot is the sponsor. And what the sponsor does is help connect it into the operational system. So the sponsor is very skilled and trained at knowing how to accommodate change into the system. Most operational systems are rigid. They are not loose. They're not flexible and adaptive. So in the complexity framework, what's different about the operational is that it tries to accommodate change. It's a different mindset that you bring to the operational to welcome and flex the system to accommodate the change. That's the role of the sponsor. And then once you get that, you get adaptability. Adaptability only happens when it's converted into the system in the form of new order. Otherwise, it's just movements. It's not, it's movements, it's some creativity, but it's not adaptability. It's not true innovation in the form of new order. What we now know is that sponsor is critically important and it's everywhere. And I will not even work with an organization unless I talk with them about sponsor and we work to engage the sponsor. And the sponsor is critical in helping making sure that that process occurs all throughout. So what you want to do is you convene, this is a summary, you bring the right people together, you get them to commit to the challenge, it's a complexity challenge, you start doing the conflicting, so you support that conflicting. We had an experience last year where we did some conflicting and word got out of our adaptive space for another part of the organization, and that part said, oh my gosh, they're trying to get rid of us. and it went straight up to the top. The person at the top came in with the hammer and slammed it down and said, no, this can't happen. And I went to my partner and I said, no, that can't happen. We have to get back to those people and fix this. So in organizations that are not used to this, you have to really work on getting them to understand they can't take the conflicting out of context. They have to look for connecting. So you're looking for sparks and links that enable connecting. And again, there's a whole process around that. In the model, then, if we think about the two levels of conflicting and connecting, the first two on the right, on the top, are the ideation. The second two are the scaling. Foster ideation, connect to find solutions. Then you provide feedback information for conflicting and the scaling, and then you link up to drive innovation. All right. I promised I would talk about this, but I'm really close to time. I see the clock. So I'm just going to mention that there's the brick wall, and that's what happened last year. We hit the brick wall, the organization we were working with, because we didn't have the connections with the very top. I told you exactly what happened when it went out of our local system. It went to another area, went up to the top, and came down in the form of a brick wall. A hammer slams down, says, "No, you can't do this." So when conflict is not converted to conflicting, and that's what happened. We had to switch this to conflicting. We got back with the other person. We said, hey, this is conflicting. And once we started doing it, they said, oh yeah, I agree with you. Once we had the conversation, they said, I have that problem too. So you convert it to conflicting. If you don't do that, if you keep it in conflict, it shuts down the adaptive process. And in cultures that are plagued by brick walls, people expend extra energy dealing with this. And what they'll do is they'll find workarounds. They get really skilled at workarounds. All right, so to address it, know that it's a natural part of the process. You want to expect it. You approach it from that standpoint. Don't ask for a yes, no. You instead do inquiry approach and listen to how you can, what the other side has to say. And by the time you take it for approval, you should have the votes already lined up. So when we did our core change, because we did this process, and they allowed me to help them guide through, by the time we got to the faculty vote, there was not a single comment. And people came, my colleagues came with notes, they're ready to fight. And I said, nope, not going to happen. Not a single comment. So you've done all the work ahead of time. Now you're just basically stamping for approval. All right, I made it. I said it would be 45 minutes. Got to 47. So we have a little bit of time for questions and comments. So you're still muted. Okay.
Thank you, ma'am. I think there seems to be some technical, at our end. So
Okay.
we do have a couple of questions, which we'll put it forward to you. So just give me a moment.
Okay, no worries.
So one of the first question by one of our participants is, it goes like this: according to your research, has complexity leadership post the pandemic, the new normal, made a leader's job easy or difficult? And how has it affected private sector leadership versus the public sector leadership as they function differently?
Okay, so has it made a leader's job difficult? I think, so it has complexity leadership made it difficult. I would say complexity has made it difficult, but I would say when you use complexity leadership, it's less difficult. That would be my short answer to that. I would also say that some people, they naturally get this. This is always going to be there. Complexity is always going to be there. So for many people, they love this. This is fun. For my partner, Matt Zurich at Cook Children's, this is naturally how he operates. It's why he's brought into his position. He would, I think if you told him you have a choice between complexity or bureaucracy, there's no question he would take complexity any day. And I hate to say this, it's kind of fun. It's interesting and it's fun. And if you've got an organization that does it, you feel an energy around it. It's very energizing versus just the more traditional bureaucracy. And as far as private public, it's very hard to say. I think both are experiencing challenges. I think that the public is experiencing it in ways that they have a little bit less ability to control because shareholders are driving things. I know here in Texas, we've got a lot of politics that are happening. And even in the US, the politics, if you're watching the politics, if you're in a public institution, in education in the US, they don't have any protection from it. We're a private school, so we have a little more protection. It's really about managing our stakeholders, which is the trustees, but we don't have the politicians trying to politicize everything. So I think everybody's going through it. I think it's just a matter of how people are responding to it.
Thank you so much for answering that. We have another question which says, Prof, I do agree complexity does open adaptability. Do you see the correlation of adaptability adding more complexity or making organization prone to get into complex situation, looking example of SpaceX?
Yes, complexity opens up more complexity. There's no question about it. And I will tell you that in my own experience of this, as you engage in it, it can be exhausting. I love the work when I'm guiding people through it, but I've become department chair, and as I told you, I'm now in it. And it can be very draining. And in fact, in our organization here at TCU, we're in major growth. And so they've decided, we were supposed to be capped at 10,000 students. They decided to go to 18,000. This is a huge shift, and we're doing it in a very quick way because we're a 100-year-old university that historically was capped at 10,000. And all of a sudden they're growing it. And as they're growing it, it's breaking everything. It's not the systems, the processes, the procedures we had in place are not working, and they're not adjusting it along the way. And I'm exhausted from it. So I keep going to people in the college and I'm saying, guys, we can't manage our way through this. We have to lead through this. We have to change our mindset. It's not just how do we deal with what comes at us. We've got to be proactive. So in the fall, as department chair, I had to do scheduling. We schedule our senior strategy course, which is the core course for the graduating seniors. During enrollment, we were told we're 400 seats short in our strategy classes. 400. I mean, we have classes of 30, 35. This was stunning. So we had to go in crisis mode, and it was an unfolding process of emergence. We opened up sections, and then after we opened them, they said, oh, why did you do it that way? You should have put restrictions on it so it only could be seniors, graduating seniors. Nobody told us that. So when we opened it, all the students piled in. Now we had another problem because we still didn't have enough seats for the graduating seniors. So we had to open more, you see? So I said after this, why didn't you all tell me? I know you told me we have an increasing number of students, but you didn't say, Mary, you need to look at your strategy courses. Or why didn't you tell us when you put the new sections in, make sure you restrict it? So this is a difference. It's a shift. And I think that I'm really very much living and experiencing what the training that you need to do in organizations to get people to change the way they think. So I went to Lynn, who is our assistant dean, who manages the advisors, and I said, the person who did this, I have no problem with it. She did tell me they're graduating, but couldn't she have told me the implication of that? She said, yeah, I totally see that. So again, I think that complexity does open up for more complexity, but we really don't have, in this case, we had a choice. We could stay small, but then there are reasons they're growing. I think that it has to do with our long-term viability and sustainability. So I think that, again, it's shifting to a new mindset around how do we engage in complexity. I would also say my request would be try not to kill us with it. Try to think more carefully about how you're doing it. And in places like SpaceX, I mean, Elon Musk is just a complexity person. He's entrepreneurial. He's always going to push these things. He's radical and disruptive. The people who work in his organization are used to that. He hires people for that. And if you're not a complexity person, you don't stay in those organizations.
Dr. Uhl-Bien, there was one question that was of interest to some of us, which is that the pandemic seems to also have changed the relationship between, say, leaders and subordinates or managers and followers, and it has thrown forth a number of organizational challenges, for example, around DEI or work from home, or, working with Gen X, which has now started, Gen Z, which has started coming into organizations. And many managers and leaders seem to struggle with adapting to this change. So, is
Yes.
there something in your experience or through your work that you could offer which could give us some hope, or, give us some ideas around how to adapt to this change?
I think my number one thing would be managing your own exhaustion. The biggest thing I'm seeing is burnout. And again, I'm experiencing it myself since I've been put in this position. When I'm an academic and I'm advising, I love it. I have so much energy. I tell people, go do this. Now that I'm in it, I'm saying, boy, I really prefer teaching it rather than doing it because it is exhausting. And in the work that we're doing with organizations, health or the healthcare in particular, well-being and addressing burnout are major, major issues that are coming up. So that's the number one thing I would say is taking care of yourself and focusing on energy and addressing burnout that happens from this. Try to keep yourself in a situation that it's not constantly in crisis. And if you're doing complexity, you're doing it in a more fun way. All right, so as far as the relationship between managers and subordinates, it has shifted dramatically. During COVID, it was shocking because you would think that the employees would have been at risk, but it flipped. Organizations needed employees, and we had this great resignation, which was such a fascinating dynamic. Now they call it quiet layoffs because layoffs are happening everywhere. Started seeing it last year and I was saying, what in the world? Nobody's talking about this. They're doing it flying under the radar. This is a complexity term I use. You fly under the radar and organizations are flying under the radar on it. They are sneaking around. They're trying to regain control. They are taking back the authority and the power because, as you understand, authority was taken away. Employees had voice and power and collective power that they had never had before. So that's an ongoing, that's historically a trend that's always going to be there. That's not new from complexity. It was just exacerbated by complexity and made more visible and prominent. We had the power of the people and the worker. We're now on the downshift, and that's being taken back away. You see a lot of reaction and reactionary things happening in the US. Again, they're going after DEI. It's a political move, and that political move is trying to aggregate a following and really energize people. I think that they find politically they need to have something that is a tag for their group to unite them together. And once they lost over here abortion, they had to replace it with something else. And they found out that DEI and transgender was the thing that most energized and activated people to follow them. So lots and lots of pressures. On Gen Z, it's very different. I taught my students in the fall, and I again had a reaction of there's something fundamentally different with this group that's here. So a powerful shift in young people. I think I'm dealing with 21-year-olds. I think that the COVID really affected them. And so there's some things happening there, but there also just are generational shifts. And I think the group behind them, Gen Alpha, is going to be massively different. This is not like what we've seen in the past. So huge challenges on organizations and managers in terms of how to address and deal with the generational differences too. And then just generally, the idea of the collaborative and the process is that we've got leadership and followership together. So I view that as a co-creation. Managers need to think more about how do we co-create together and how do I understand the other? And I think that comes from both sides. So I'm also teaching the students followership and how do they co-create with leaders.
Very
Can
glad
I
to
ask
hear.
a question?
Yes, over to you, Mr. Desai. Yeah, you have.
Thanks, Mary, for your very insightful discussion and presentation. I have a question or two questions. They are related. You see, I run a large organization. I founded, and so on. Typical response of management would be, no, no, I don't think there is any complexity here. We are clear what we are doing, etc., etc. So, is there any indicators of complexity which are apparent and seen, you see, so that the practitioners and the leaders in the organization can sensitize that yes, we are getting more and more complex. So that's one. Having asked that question, obviously the complexity as a scale in any case, in the sense that one would call highly complex versus somebody who is just kind of at a different level of complexity. So, do you have any kind of scaling process? Because it's contextual, as you would guess. Each organization is different, each situations are different. So it can't be one big creature called complexity. It has to be a definition across. So the related questions. One is, what are the indicators for complexity, and what are the scales for complexity?
Okay, so as far as the indicators of complexity, this is a slide I had in here, but I hid it because I didn't have enough time to talk about it the first time. But if you can see this, this is what we call the footprint of complexity in organizations. How do we know we're in complexity? First, there's an adaptive challenge. So that complexity pressure that I talked about with no known solution. Often this is accompanied by new partnerships. So people are brought together that haven't worked together before. And those people or units or groups that are brought together have heterogeneous worldviews and perspectives. So they bring conflicting needs and ideas. And then the real kicker is the interdependence. They have to work together and engage, usually across boundaries and disciplines. And this is what I call adapt or die. This is when these things are happening, that's when you have complexity happening. So if you've got a technical situation, you've got something where you know the solution is out there. You usually have a group of people who have generally worked together before, they know how to work together. You have a little bit less heterogeneity, you have some homogeneity. It's more complicated, but you don't need to have the dynamics we're talking about to resolve it. And again, you don't usually have to engage across new boundaries and disciplines to get this done. So that's how I would answer your first question and how you know you're in complexity. In our research, the key indicator was pressures. People were feeling the complexity pressures. As far as the kind of people, you mentioned people who do this well and those who don't. We have been using what we call, or what is called, growth versus fixed mindset. So that's Carol Dweck's work. If you have a growth mindset, you tend to be more open to the ideas of complexity. That's what I'm going to use with the group next week when I talk individual level. A fixed mindset believes that, you know, it's black and white and there's one answer and failure is a bad thing. Whereas a growth mindset says, I don't care about failure. I'm going to learn from it. I'm going to adapt and grow in this. So that's how to address that. I think that was your second question. Did I miss anything or did I answer it?
I was asking about the scale in a way, some kind of scaling issue. Is there some numeric, or is there anything that kind of, when you assess as a consultant an organization, the enormity of task, if I may call it, depends on the nature of complexity and
Right.
the size of complexity. So do you have any such measure, or is it something?
Now, I personally do not, and I resisted that because I came out of Leader Member Exchange, which was basically a scale, an LMX7 measure, and I have a tremendous distaste for that because it tries to say that you can assess leader member relationships and draw all these conclusions through 7 questions you ask a subordinate. So I didn't like that, but they just opened a complexity leadership lab at Australian National University. And I was in Canberra in December as they were opening this lab. And my partner there is very much into this. He's very much into thinking about the measurement. He's been playing around with complexity and tools for doing that. So we're on the verge of partnering to see if we can develop that and get more to quantify it more. So yes, that's in the works.
Yeah, because that would greatly help in terms of practicing world, in terms of uh, understanding the enormity of the problem. You see, we in practice we only understand numbers. So
That's right.
you are 8 or 1 or 7, kind of
Yeah.
triggers an
Yeah.
action. I'm asking push for an action that is needed, and the
Yes.
scale helps there.
I will share with you, and I am going to say this, I say this with tremendous delicacy and affection for people in organizations and higher level leaders. But one of the challenges is the focus on numbers is really limiting people. It limits the mindset and the thinking. And I think that it's become something that you can rely on and it limits innovation. I was just reading an article talking about CEOs and high-level executives, and they said that now they're the least innovative and least risky they've ever been. So in response to COVID, people have pulled in. I think they're going back to that order response. And this issue of growth, they're completely challenged with how they're going to grow. And I think people are worn out and exhausted from all the complexity. So they're trying to pull back down to order. And I would say, I think we need to get back up into some complexity thinking from that group. And when I was working with a colleague who was on the CEO 100, he was really in the early days of 2010, 12, trying to get CEOs to think like this because this is how he thought. And he went around and explored them all and he came back and he said, Mary, I'm sorry, I have bad news. None of them think like this. They're not going to get it. They're just so enamored with results and numbers that they're almost obsessed by it. So I don't mean that disrespectfully. I just mean it to say, yes, we do need that evidence and we're going to do that. And I am fully a person because I do academic research on evidence, but I think people also need to open up to think differently about what evidence means and not just numbers.
Thank
May
you,
I squeeze in
Shanta.
a couple
Thank
of
you.
questions?
Yes, Professor Arun, you have a question?
Yeah, I have two very quick questions. One is that in your model, you describe the importance of key persons in managing, complexity, right? So who are these key persons? How do you identify the key persons? So are these people with authority in the organization, or are these people with the least status quo bias? That is, people, senior managers who are the most willing to accept change. Right, that's
Yes.
my first question. My second question is that in your model, it's almost implicit that the leader has both legitimacy and authority. But in a lot of public health institutions in India, the leaders, typically called the medical superintendents here, they are
Yes.
temporary positions appointed for a period of 2 years, right? So
Mhm.
if the leader has a temporary position, does not have legitimacy or authority, can the same model of adaptive change work? So these are my two questions. Thank you.
Wonderful questions. On the first one, that ties to the convening. Who do you bring together? And there are two levels of it. One is, who are you bringing together to ideate? So, for example, when we work on our challenges here, I have a process I go through with the organization, and essentially, it's who do you need in the room? Who has the information? So, with Texas Health, we did length of stay. Who do you need? And that we convened people around that. We used length of stay to say, what are all the spikes of that challenge that we need to bring into the room? So that would be step one on who you bring together. Now, when I work with Matt at Cook Children's, I'll say we were working on, they had done consolidation. He has 600, I think he now has 1,000 direct reports because they're bringing physicians into the system and they had no hierarchy. So our first complexity challenge 3 years ago when we started our 2.0 program, long story there, but it was how to write a job description for a medical director. And I said, Matt, no way, that is not a complexity challenge. You haven't been listening to anything. And he said, no, Mary, you need to listen to us. As soon as he started describing it, there are all of these things that go into defining that role. We had to create a hierarchy that wasn't there before. We've just started doing that. So I told Matt, all right, we need medical directors. When you bring that group together to discuss this and do a job description, I don't want you to just bring the people who are all on board. I want you to think carefully about who's in the room. And we know we're going to have cohorts, so we're going to roll this out. So bring some people that you really need there for ideation. Bring some people that you think might be against this, so that you get some good ideation that way, and leave some of your key people out for cohort 2 or to help because this group is going to reach out to them. So there's a whole design process around how you think carefully about who you bring into that adaptive space. It doesn't have to be everybody. It depends on what you're trying to do. I hope that helps answer that one. And again, I could say more, but that's the basic of it. And then as far as the sponsors, the other key people, this has to be people who can open doors, who can break down brick walls. It's a requirement for us. And we learned this from Cook Children's. So when we started with Cook in our 1.0 program, Britt Nelson started that. He was the first president of the physician network we worked with. This was his baby. We weren't doing the adaptive space. We were just doing leadership development, but we were doing it around complexity. And they had all these people in the back of the room. Our group, our center staff were saying, they're the peanut gallery. Like, what the heck are they doing in the back of the room? they were executives, high-level executives who were sitting back there and they were listening and they were engaging and they were processing. We thought they were judging us, which they were. They were checking out the program, but they learned. And then we learned the importance of that. So now with Matt in our 2.0 program, Matt will sit and listen to the conversation. He'll pull off all the stuff and he'll go out and fix it before it even becomes a problem. He's like, oh, I'm going to see this, and I go out and he works it through the system. And we didn't have that with our other program. So what would happen is we didn't have the high level sponsor. That's why we hit the brick wall. And I told them, this is the learning we get from this program, is to understand what the brick wall is and trying to message the organization that you have them. Cook Children's doesn't have brick walls as much because that team is so used to it. And what we'll do is we'll bring in panels. I know all the executives now. If I need something, I'll call in the CFO. I'll call in the president of the hospital system. I'll call in Nancy Cycle. We bring them in, we sit them there. We say, this is what we're dealing with. Here are the challenges. What do you think? We have Jim Cunningham, who knows all the regulation. He'll say, no, we can't use that title for the new medical director. We can't call him a division chief. I think they worked through it because of these regulatory issues. But here's what I'm going to do to help you. So it's this ongoing discussion together. And I really feel without those sponsors, you can't get this done because they create the conditions at the high level. They help break down the brick walls. On the legitimacy and authority and temporary people, it all depends. So if that temporary assignment is viewed the way it is in a lot of rotating roles that I see, which is I've just come in and do a job for a bit, I have a standard job description and I'm implementing it, then they're not going to have the ownership. This is how our Academy of Management is run. They rotate people through every year. And I've told them over and over again, this is ridiculous. This is why this organization has not advanced, because you've got people coming in and basically doing just checking boxes. They're not leading, they're not strategic. And even when we implemented a ton of strategic change in the group when I was in the 5-year track. We did it together. The history's gone because then they bring new people in and nobody knows what happened before. So it happens over again. So Ron Piccolo, who's my co-author, was later on the track and the group was saying, we need to do this. And Ron's like, we did it. We did this when Mary was in, we did this when Anne was in as chair. We've just lost the history. So I'm a little skeptical of people who are in temporary positions and whether that can work, because I'm not sure the investment is there, the long-term thinking is there. I do really believe you need authority, but remember, it's collective and collaborative, so you need a lot of people without authority. The vast majority of people who are doing this are not going to have technical authority over what's going on, but you need the sponsors who do have the authority that can help them. I hope that answered it.
Thank you, professors. I think in the interest of time, I will now will not be able to take any more questions. And now I request Sonali to propose the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Shweta. So, on behalf of the Ashang Desai Center for Leadership and Organizational Development at IIM Ahmedabad, I extend sincere gratitude to Professor Mary, first of all, for readily accepting our invite, and then telling us about rich interconnectivity, that is complexity, and telling us that complexity is not always complex. That's a thought-provoking phenomenon for all of us. It's a food for thought to take home today. Professor, we not only look up to you in our academic pursuits, but also your grace and humbleness has set up standards for us professionally. Thank you very much for all of those understanding and your humbleness that you've shown throughout this process in the past few weeks with all of us. I also extend my sincere thank you to our patron, Mr. Ashang Desai, without whose presence any event at ADCLOD is incomplete. Thank you for being with us here today, sir. I'm also going to say a big thank you to the organizing team out here, beginning with Professor Niharika, who wasn't here, but of course she was the one beginning with curating all of these sessions, the person who got in touch with Professor Mary here, Professor Kirti, Ms. Shweta, Ms. Shubhangi, and Ms. Pooja for seamlessly handling today's session. A special mention to the Zoom team as well for the seamless webinar that we've seen today. Last but not the least, I thank all the attendees who are here. I hope that we've all taken away meaningful awards from this particular session that has happened today. Finally, the Ashank Desai Center for Organizational Development, for Leadership and Organizational Development at IIM Ahmedabad is dedicated to advancing knowledge in the field of leadership and organizational development and change. And we keep curating these kind of sessions with stalwarts all across the world, such as today. And we hope to see you in many, many other events like today. Thank you very much. I hand it over back to Professor Kirti. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonali. Yes, Dr. Mary, thank you so much for being with us today. It has been a delight to interact with you, and we hope we will continue to stay in touch and hope to see you in India sometime soon. And I remember you said at the beginning this was your first experience of offering a talk in India, and we look forward to many more talks, at our institute and in our country. Thank you so much.
Thank
Yes.
you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye. See ya.
Thank you.
Bye.